On September 1st, 2025, the United States military blew up a boat from Venezuela in the Caribbean Sea. It was alleged that the people in the boat were members of the gang Tren de Aragua and that they were smuggling cocaine, fentanyl, and other illegal substances into the United States through an elaborate network that combined multiple boat and plane trips between South America and the USA. If these claims are true, then it is almost certain that these drug traffickers were working in coordination with the Cartel de los Soles, which in English means Cartel of the Suns. The Cartel of the Suns is not a traditional criminal organization that operates outside of the law like the Sinaloa or Medellin cartels. Instead, they exist within factions of the Venezuelan military and operate under the blessing of the government leaders. While Nicolás Maduro is the president of Venezuela, he cannot go against the Cartel of the Suns as they form a crucial base to his power. Likewise, the cartel enjoys a symbiotic relationship with Maduro, where an open conflict with him would put their position and wealth at jeopardy. The Cartel of the Suns is basically government corruption on steroids, while also being hopped up on amphetamines, with their power primarily limited to within the borders of their country. They are an essential part of the drug trade, but they do not manufacture or distribute the products on a retail level. Instead, they form a crucial part of the distribution chain. The Cartel of the Suns brings cocaine and other drugs from Colombia through their land border. The drugs then pass through the country to the ports on Venezuela's northern coast, where they then are put on boats for the next stage of their journey. In a way, they are similar to services like FedEx and DHL, except they kill anyone who gets in their way. The relationship between the military members who are part of the Cartel of the Suns and the government leaders that condone and benefit from their activities makes Venezuela fall under the definition of a narco-state. But this wasn't always the situation. At one time, the country was the richest in South America, with its citizens taking weekend trips to Miami to go shopping. Now, it is one of the poorest. Here is how that country declined and how the Cartel of the Suns rose. The name Cartel of the Suns comes from the sun insignia that is worn on the shoulders of Venezuelan generals. While the corruption there is so blatant and in the open today, 50 years ago, that was far from the case. In 1970, the Bolivar, Venezuela's currency, was one of the most powerful forms of money on the planet. That year, 4.5 of them would get you $1. Today, you need more than 250 of them to make that exchange, and that's if someone is actually willing to take them in a trade. The country was rich with oil. Some people called it the Saudi Arabia of the Western Hemisphere, and they also called its capital city, Caracas, the Paris of South America. Times were great then because of all the money its oil industry was bringing in. Buildings and highways were being constructed, the middle class was growing, and the country had a stable democracy. People's bellies were full, and their lives were getting better. The future looked bright. But it had one fatal problem. The economy depended completely on its oil exports. In the 1980s, the global price of oil crashed, and it sent Venezuela into a deep recession. This was at a period in history when left-wing politics was seeing a surge in popularity across Latin America during the global Cold War. Plus, with the good times suddenly over, cracks in the system were becoming visible, and they showed corruption. Around this time, a young lieutenant named Hugo Chávez graduated from the Military Academy of Venezuela. He had become a dedicated Marxist, and created a secret group within the military called the Bolivarian Revolutionary Army. Another man named Nicolás Maduro was driving a bus during these days while also spending his free time as a union organizer. Maduro also spent some time in Cuba getting a political education, and the two men would find themselves as political allies in the 1990s. By the end of the 1980s, the financial crisis of Venezuela stabilized, but it was clear that the good times were over and not coming back anytime soon. The exchange rate was now 47 bolivars for $1. The country needed a loan from the International Monetary Fund, but it came with strings attached that promoted austerity. These measures were unpopular, and Carlos Andrés Pérez won the presidency in the 1988 election by being opposed to the measure. But like a politician, Pérez soon began to adopt the restrictive measures once he got into office, which led to riots. The military was called in to suppress the violence and destruction with a heavy hand that only led to the government becoming less popular with the people. At the same time, Hugo Chávez, who was now a lieutenant colonel, had been growing his secret movement, and it's estimated that at least 10% of the armed forces belonged to it. On February 4, 1992, Chávez attempted to overthrow the democratically elected government. The plot failed, dozens died, and he was captured. He appeared on television to beg the rest of his movement to abandon their revolution and stand down, for now. This address introduced him to the people, and he won the hearts and minds of the poor. He was seen as a hero who stood up to the corrupt and wicked. Chávez was imprisoned, but by 1995, he was released and free. While his military career was over, he now had a bright political one ahead of him. In addition to being praised in his own country by sympathetic politicians hoping to use his star to make theirs brighter, he was received as a hero in Cuba and also toured Latin America to promote his Marxist movement. It's also during this time that he met Nicolás Maduro, and the younger man began to be part of the older one's orbit. Chávez won the 1998 presidential election, and in 1999 he assumed the office. Maduro also began his official political career at this time when he was elected to the country's Congress. The bolivar had lost value during this time, but in the 2000s it would start to destabilize. It's under Hugo Chávez that the Cartel of the Suns rose in power. Before his term, individual members of the military were corrupt and would look the other way to let drug smugglers pass by them if the price was right. But during the 2000s, Chávez restructured the government, giving more power to the military. This allowed the corruption to grow in scale and become institutionalized. While Chávez was a leftist and regularly denounced the United States in his speeches, he continued the country's previous agreement to cooperate with the DEA. But in 2005, the relations broke down between the two countries and he expelled the organization. The last check against Venezuela, becoming a narco-state, was removed. With very rare exceptions, most dictators in history do not hold absolute power over everyone. Instead, they hold together a coalition of captains with their own power bases that must be balanced. Hugo Chávez was no exception, and his most powerful backer was Diosdado Cabello. Cabello has been called the godfather of the Cartel of the Suns, with control of the factions in the military that make up this criminal organization. Numerous U.S. indictments and testimony from defectors place him at the head of coordinating the military's involvement in the drug trade. Cabello was an early backer of Chávez's presidential campaign. In 2002, a coup threw Chávez out of power for 47 hours until the military, under the direction of Cabello, reinstalled him. Chávez might have been the official leader, but he depended on the military and needed to reward them. One of the first acts was to place Cabello's people in the military at critical border posts. These positions allowed for the trafficking and smuggling of drugs, oil, and illegally mined gold to pass through the country. As the country's currency value continued to collapse, these connected people were able to supplement themselves with foreign money. It not only supported them financially, but it made them incredibly rich. During this time, Nicolás Maduro continued to rise through Hugo Chávez's inner circle. The younger man avoided outshining the older, more powerful one, and he also conducted himself in a way that avoided conflicts and making enemies. Maduro was soon promoted to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was one of the few high-level members of the government who never served in the military. Hugo Chávez's health took a downturn in 2010, and by 2012, he knew he was dying. One of the last things he did publicly was endorse Maduro as his successor. When Chávez died later that year, Maduro was made the temporary president, and an election was held in 2013. For the first time since Chávez's rise to power, the result was not a sweeping victory. Officially, Maduro won by 1.5 points. When a recount was demanded by the opposition parties, it was only partially carried out, with the results being that Maduro's victory stands. But his win was far from a mandate. With Maduro's position of power weaker than Chávez's, he was more dependent on the military. Likewise, the military, and especially the Cartel of the Suns, was highly dependent on him as well, since an opposition party victory could lead to their downfall. Every one of Maduro's 3 elections have had accusations that they were rigged. While Venezuela slid into a practical dictatorship under Chávez, he at least had the legitimacy of saying he was being constantly democratically re-elected. If Maduro were to somehow lose power, then it's clear that the corrupt institutions holding him up would not go down without a fight. If those boats that were blown up were smugglers and part of Tren de Aragua, then it is almost certain that this drug run was conducted in coordination with the Cartel of the Suns, which means that official members of the government at high levels were involved. The military controls all of the ports, plus they have radars and small vessels that are used for patrols. It would be extremely difficult for a drug runner to avoid these obstacles without paying the right people to look the other way. In other words, the only way to bring large batches of drugs out of Venezuela is to have the government's permission. Another indication that the government is involved in the smuggling is the fact that a lot of fuel is needed for these boats to make their long journeys. Fuel in Venezuela is rationed and policed. The only way to get the quantity needed for these runs is to have someone connected provide it. Smuggling drugs out of Venezuela is a state-regulated black market and not a free-for-all. In addition to Diosdado Cabello, other key figures in the organization are General Vladimir Padrino Lopez, Hugo Carvajal, and Nestor Reverol. General Lopez is the country's defense minister and thus head of all the armed forces, both corrupt and non-corrupt. Hugo Carvajal is the former head of military intelligence, while Nestor Reverol is the former Minister of the Interior and was also, ironically, the head of the anti-drug police. Hugo Carvajal was arrested in Spain in 2019 by Interpol. A Spanish court demanded his release, and shortly after that, he disappeared again. He was rearrested in Madrid in 2021. In 2023, he was extradited to the United States for drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges. In June 2025, he pled guilty. It's unknown what intelligence he shared with the United States about Maduro and the Cartel of the Suns. Tarek el-Aissami was Venezuela's former vice president and oil minister. He is also believed to be the architect of the cartel's money laundering structure. It was reported that he was arrested in 2023 as part of a government purge. It's unclear of who exactly gave the order to get rid of him. The Venezuela government's allies are Cuba, Russia, and China. All of these countries are unfriendly with the US, and it's been alleged that the mass infiltration of the United States by Tren de Aragua and other criminals, combined with the influx of fentanyl, is part of a strategy to destabilize America from the inside. Under President Trump, tensions between America and Venezuela have increased, and this had culminated so far with the destruction of boats that are suspected of running drugs out of the South American country. Trump demanded that Maduro step down from the presidency and leave Venezuela during a recent phone call that the two leaders had. Maduro proposed that instead, he vacate the presidency while being allowed to retain control of the military. Under this arrangement, the corrupt officials who presided over the Cartel of the Suns would be able to keep their infrastructure in place while also dominating over a new civilian government. The proposal was rejected by the United States. Ultimately, our picture of the Cartel of the Suns, their exact organization, and their relationship to Tren de Aragua is only partial, and the little we do know comes from lower-level informants. In 2004, Venezuelan journalist Mauro Marcano tried to expose the cartel, and he was murdered. Since then, others have been afraid to expose the country's corruption. Perhaps one day when the government of Venezuela changes and becomes more open with the world, these records will become available. Until then, we can only look at it from the outside and try to make sense of what we can see through the fog.